What exactly is gender? In our age of widespread confusion, the Christian worldview offers clarity and a vision for gender that's true, good, and beautiful. That's the topic of the next Lighthouse Voices event on October 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern. Our featured speaker is Dr. Abigail Favale, author of The Genesis of Gender. Dr. Favale will provide a Christian perspective on gender rooted in Scripture and examine how this view compares and clashes with secular views of gender. You can attend in person at the Focus on the Family bookstore in Holland, Michigan, or online via live stream. Claim your spot today at colsoncenter.org/lighthousevoices. That's colsoncenter.org/lighthousevoices. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. Through all the ups and downs of revival, revolution, expansion, war, and awakening, there have been two religious shifts in American history that dwarfed all the others. The first was the period after the Civil War, when millions of Americans pieced their lives back together and returned en masse to worship, a Great Dechurching, if you will. The second is happening right now. Millions of Americans have left and continue to leave churches. Everyone is affected, liberal, conservative, urban, rural, rich, and poor, across traditions. It's been called the biggest social shift in our lifetimes. For the first time since reliable records have been kept, a majority of Americans are not members of a church. For those in ministry, this raises a ton of questions that feel urgent and existential. Who are the dechurching? Why are they leaving? Where are they going for spiritual answers? What's becoming of their belief? And how, if at all, can churches win them back? These are the questions at the heart of a groundbreaking new book by Pastor Jim Davis, Michael Graham, and Ryan Burge. It's called The Great Dechurching. Who's leaving? Why are they going? And what will it take to bring them back? It's packed with social science and new information, but the heart of the book is really pastoral. It offers answers to those burning questions. And I found many of those answers to be extremely surprising. Today, I welcome one of the authors, Michael Graham, to explain the Great Dechurching. Michael Graham is Program Director for the Keller Center for Cultural Apologetics. He's also the executive producer and writer of the As in Heaven podcast. Michael Graham, welcome to Upstream.
Thank you for having me, Shane.
Well, I remember writing a few years ago for Breakpoint about the dying mainline churches, those sort of husks of buildings that you see when you drive through any major city in the United States. And they're usually adorned with like a rainbow flag or the gender flag these days and a sign that says all are welcome. But, not many people are taking up the invitation if you walk into the church on Sunday morning. And I remember contrasting them with evangelical denominations at the time, right? This is in the 2010s, and how they were sort of holding steady, or at least it seemed that way. Now that's no longer true. Give us the big picture of what's happening to the church in America, please.
Yeah, so at the highest level, what we're looking at here is 40 million people who are adult Americans who used to go to church at least once a month, now going less than once per year. So that's 1 in 6 American adults. About 30 of those 40 million people left in a very haphazard, casual, apathetic, banal, reasons like I moved, or attendance was inconvenient, or there was some kind of family shift like divorce, remarriage, a child being born, or becoming empty nesters, COVID-19, travel, sports, these kinds of things. Things of just the inertia of American life and so forth. Then about 10 million people left more catastrophically. That first group we call the casually dechurched, and the 10 million, roughly 1/4, we call the dechurched casualties. These are people who have significant church hurt, who have had a lot of friction either interpersonally or with the church as an institution, or both. And the animating concerns for those two groups at the highest levels are quite different, as well as their willingness to return to the houses of worship that they left. Now, of the 40 million people who left, roughly 15 million of those left evangelical churches, and about 20 million left mainline or Roman Catholic churches. Mainline and Roman Catholic churches, people left earlier. In the mainline churches, they left in the late 80s through the mid 90s. And then among Roman Catholics, that phenomenon was early 90s to late 90s. And then evangelicals have been playing catch up basically from the mid 90s till today. So roughly the last 30 years. And the shape of evangelical dechurching has been exponential in terms of its rate of increase, whereas the shape of the departure out of the mainline and Roman Catholic churches was largely linear. And so, in other words, evangelicals have been playing catch up, like we sometimes do on a lot of different things. So,
Michael, if you graph all this out and you kind of transfer people from one category to the other, right? Because it's got to equal 100% in the end. And you have people dropping out of evangelical churches at an exponential rate. So that's like the main story now. As the decline of the main line sort of tapers off, the decline of evangelicals has accelerated, if I'm hearing you correctly. What is the category they're going to? What is the slice of the pie chart that encompasses those who have left the church? Or is there not one slice?
a lot of the questions that you're going to ask me are going to have the same answer. And that same answer is it's complicated. So, with our data set, particularly, we have the most granular data on the 15 million people who left evangelical churches. And our social scientist, Ryan Burge, whose expertise is in religious data in the United States, he ran a machine learning algorithm over the data set that we had there. So, roughly about 600 different data points on a few thousand dechurched evangelicals. 4 profiles. These would be clusters of people who have very similar answer choices on demographics, on why they left, the percentage who would be willing to return, and the reasons why they would be willing to return. They vary pretty widely in terms of how they self-identify now. 28% self-identify as Catholic now, 24% as Protestant, 13% as some form of other Christian, 15% other world religion, 10% atheist agnostic, 7% are nuns, 4% are something else. So it varies pretty widely. Those who were of one profile, look far more Catholic than others. Some, other profiles look far more Protestant. So it varies in the granularity when you start drilling down into which type of dechurched evangelical you're looking at in terms of how people self-identify. But then people can self-identify one way, but then when you look at the beliefs that they hold to, it's like, okay, these are evangelical beliefs and not Catholic. And so, in sociology of religion, you have belief, behavior, and belonging. And each one of those, 3 things kind of influences the other. But if you imagine like 3 tanks where each can have like gasoline in each of them, you can have every form of permutation and combination of, lots of belonging, but the beliefs have eroded, but the behaviors are still there. And any kind of permutation and combination where it's like, well, I still believe these things, but I'm not belonging. I'm not going to church, but yet I'm still largely following, kind of the ethics of the scriptures or whatever. So, each one of these different profiles looks very different with respect to belief, behavior, and belonging. And so this is why, anecdotally, we knew this from our experience pastorally in Central Florida, in Orlando, but we just didn't know what we were looking at. And we needed, I had a professor at RTS Orlando, Mike Glotto, who always used to say, if there's mist in the pulpit, there's fog in the pews. And when we were looking at dechurching, it was just mist to us. And so it was fog in the pews. And so Jim and I are both really curious people, and so is Ryan. And we had a lot of questions, and we wanted answers. And we wanted answers, 1, just because we're curious, but 2, because we needed actionable insights of how do we pastor in light of this? Because we were sitting on anecdotal data that said that almost half of our city had dechurched. In 2018, according to Barna, 6% of Orlando was evangelical. Well, that was the same rate at the same time as Seattle or New York City. So why is it that Orlando didn't feel quite as pagan as Seattle or New York City? And we realized it was because those cities were unchurched, but our city was dechurched. And so that had an impact on the way that you experience, just even, the habits, rhythms, beliefs in vestigial Christianity that is still a little bit in the water in our context.
We're in much the same context. In fact, I'm not that far of a drive from you. I'm over in Lakeland. But it resonates. What you're saying right now really resonates, and especially in the opening parts of the book, with my experience, where there hasn't been in the southern parts of the US, in Florida, right, which is its own thing in many ways, but there hasn't been this sort of like rise of rabid secularism or atheism. In fact, it seems like the self-consciously atheistic and agnostic people have sort of quieted down and dropped off over recent years. It feels like the heyday of the Richard Dawkins toting, fedora wearing, aggressive evangelistic atheist was in the early 2000s, right up to about 2010. Now there's this large swath of people who still identify in some way as a Christian, right? They'll post Bible verses on social media. They speak in roughly Christian terms. They say they want to date Christians. They have all these markers that you'd associate with belief, but they've dropped out of church. They've just left. So it's like this odd sort of halfway thing that you're talking about, the spiritual state of belief but not practice, or with the three categories that you mentioned, where there's a, what were they again? Because those are really useful categories.
Yeah, belief, the head, behavior, hands, and belonging. So those are
That's very helpful. Okay, so a book like this is obviously, the question is plain, right? It's plain when we look at churches declining. We ask, why is this happening? Who's leaving? Why is it happening? Why are they going? The questions I asked in the opening. But I think there's an even bigger question that someone tuning into this podcast will be asking themselves, and that is, gosh, is this like a moment for despair? Is this a moment when we should look at the religious landscape in the United States and go, wow, we've just radically failed here, and it's time to sort of throw in the towel? What's your attitude going into this rich examination of the data and writing a book about it?
Yeah, so going into this, we had less hope than what we came out with. And we didn't set out to write a book. We did this data because we had this podcast called As in Heaven, and that podcast does a deep dive, typically about 20 episodes, on one very challenging, intractable problem per season. And problems that don't really have solutions, but where maybe a little bit of progress can be made. And so, Jim, I, Mike Aitchison, and Skylar Flowers, our role as a team is to pick really interesting topics that are big problems that we don't really know what to do with what's going on with them, but we think some progress can be made through demystifying. So when we decided that we were going to do a whole season on dechurching in America, we figured we would just, digest all of the research that was out there, and then we would, write a season and, pick our guests based on those things. Well, we realized that there just wasn't much data, and the data that was there wasn't super actionable, and it was old, and the sample sizes weren't great. And so we needed pastorally actionable information, and information that would be actionable for people who were in the pews of, hey, why is my son or daughter, or my grandson, my granddaughter, or my niece or my nephew, or my coworker, or the family two doors down, why are these people no longer at church? And we didn't have that information. And so we realized after we did the study with Ryan and Paul Jupe, our two social scientists, that it would be, I guess, maybe like pastoral malpractice for us to only release what we learned in audio format. And that was confirmed when a number of publishers, many of them, approached us about, kind of writing that up. And so that's why we wanted to do this. But we came out of it with more hope than going in. We wanted to prove or disprove our hunch, our thesis, and that was that we were in the largest and fastest religious shift in American history. And that's objectively and empirically the case. The next closest 25-year shift you already alluded to, in the introduction, and that's the 25 years, basically from 1870 to 1895, right after the Civil War. And that makes sense because everybody, the war's wound down and everybody's going home and everybody's going back to church. And you also had the Second Great Awakening there, in somewhat in proximity. But all that to say, going into this, we just thought that, people were leaving for more catastrophic reasons than what they were, because if you're online or even hyper online, the digital discourse around people who are leaving church is largely around people who are not just leaving church, but deconverting. And so that's where a lot of the air has gone in the room in that conversation. So we expected to see a lot more of that percentage wise than what we observed. And the reason that there's hope for that is that over half the people who left are willing to return. Well, that's good news. That's a lot of people, more than I can even wrap my mind around. And the reasons why were very simple. It was, largely things that had to do with stuff that was within our control. And it's basically, follow the ethics of Jesus. Don't be stupid relationally. In other words, to put it in the positive and more seriously, embody relational wisdom. Okay. And build local churches that both proclaim and demonstrate that we have a gospel that's true, good, and beautiful at the same time. And really, that's kind of the bottom line of, I don't think there's anybody that we looked at, except for just the very serious deconverted, that wouldn't give a serious look at a healthy, curious, non-anxious, orthodox, and well-balanced local church that have people who are embodying the fruit of the Spirit. That's what the people are looking for. They're just looking for a healthy community and a healthy local church. And so we came out of this with way more hope than what we would have thought. Because the good news about all of those things is those are things that are largely within our control. It's within our control to show people and proclaim a robust gospel. It is within our control to grow as humans and to relate to people with a calm, non-anxious, and spirit-filled demeanor. That's within our control. And it's within our control to follow the path of sanctification into being consistent with the ethics that we have been called to of Christian behavior. If we do those things, we are going to have a much better foot forward and more trust with people. Now, in the book, we kind of outline, there's kind of three levels of people in terms of their distance in, their kind of dechurching distance. Some people, they just need a nudge from us. Other people, they need our dinner table. And other people, they need us in their lives for, years or decades, and they're probably still not coming back. But those first two people, the person who just needs a nudge, they just need a text, a phone call, an invite, hey, a water cooler moment of, I'm leading this thing at church this Sunday. Will you come and, watch me, at this? And can we go grab, barbecue after, at Four Rivers or whatever? There's a lot of people who just need a nudge, and literally something as simple as that, it would be more than enough for them to return. Then you have other people who either they've been out for a while, or maybe there's just a little bit more friction there, or maybe there's some bigger questions, or maybe there's more distrust. Those people need to be at your dinner table. They need to see healthy Christian hospitality, and there needs to be a little bit more relational intimacy that's there. And then there's just going to be a lot of people who just aren't going to return. But what we do in the book, Shane, is we help you determine who needs the nudge and who needs the dinner table, and who's less likely to return. But we also want to say that the Holy Spirit is incredibly powerful. We don't know. We don't know the mind of the Lord. We're not his counselor. And he does amazing things all the time. Every time he regenerates a heart, that's a miraculous thing. And so we want to help give people some categories of, okay, this person kind of seems a little bit like this profile or between these two profiles. And this helps me understand kind of a little bit more of where they're at. Here's, I think, here's some rails to run on of probably what they need, from me. And then we just want people to pay attention to who does God keep putting in your life consistently right in front of you. That's somebody God wants you to move, into their life, regardless of how near or far they are, from church or from the gospel. And so I think going back to that Mike Glotto quote, if there's mist in the pulpit, there's fog in the pews. If you don't have rails to run on because just the whole dechurching thing is just really confusing, it leaves you in a state of paralysis. And what we want to do, is get out the industrial fan and blow the mist and the fog away a bit and give people some simple rails to run on and some confidence that, look, for most of the people that you would, encourage to return to church, it won't end your relationship with them. And we thought it would when we were kind of, moving into this thing. But the reality is it's not. For most people, inviting them to church is probably not really going to impact, your relationship with them too much. And for some people, it might actually improve your relationship with them. Again, you'll know more. You got to read the book and, look at the different profiles and, kind of scroll through your phone and, kind of think, okay, this is this person's this and this person's that, or between these and, between that. But hopefully what we've seen anecdotally in our church is you make these things, you give people some rails to run on and some categories, to think through these things, and you give them confidence to, to take a little bit of relational risk, and it's working.
I feel like there's two great problems that become less foggy or less difficult to deal with when you apply the data and just the information that you've discovered as authors of this book to the church, to the whole landscape of the church. First problem is this: it's like this sensational or catastrophizing impulse where we come to the conclusion that, Christianity in America is essentially dead. Everyone has left because they're ex-evangelicals, the high-profile, very loud and charismatic deconverters who write op-eds or do viral TikTok videos about how they left church because of hypocrisy and scandals and because they became convinced that the church's beliefs about sexuality are homophobic or transphobic or whatever. Those are they're very loud and they're very visible, and it's easy to focus on those folks and assume, because we're anecdotally thinking creatures, that those are representative. But the data in this book really shows that they're not representative. A lot of the deconversions are happening or not deconversions, even dechurching is happening for much more mundane, banal reasons. Like you said, they're actually, some of the reasons are just kind of boring, kind of normal reasons. People just drift out. They don't, self-consciously slam the door behind them. The other problem that I'm just glad you wrote this book because it tackles this directly is that everyone looks at the issue of dechurching and they have their own opinion on why it's happening. And usually their opinion corresponds to whatever their political persuasions are, right? So there was this piece in Salon where they criticized, so Jake Meter did a review of your book at The Atlantic. Well, this writer in Salon, having not read your book yet, came back and just essentially punted to his worldview, his political beliefs, which were that Orthodox Christianity is right-wing extremism, Christian nationalism, and the reason that it's dying is because people don't want anything to do with those things. And so good riddance. But the Christians are going to pretend like it's not those things. And maybe they have a chance to make a comeback, by golly. And then he links to some, kind of shoddy research that I guess he Googled and found it supported his view of things, that everyone's an ex-evangelical, right? But those two problems seem just pervasive. And to have a book where you can bring it to pastors, you can bring it to people in your church, you can bring it to anyone who's interested in the topic and say, well, no, okay, actually there has been research done on this. These specific questions were asked of representative samples of American churchgoers or ex-churchgoers, and they found out, no, it's actually this. This is the reason. Whatever your political program is, you can't punt to that as representative because data, because science, right? And that's just very helpful and very steadying, I think, because otherwise, like you said, this fog takes hold and it allows, a lot of kind of dumb and misguided ideas to guide our actions. And that's bad.
One of the things that Ryan impressed upon us from the beginning, and for those who are listening, Ryan Burge he's a social scientist and probably perhaps the best religion data person in the United States. He's also an ordained pastor and preaches every Sunday. Really interesting guy and a good friend. But one of the things he impressed upon us, from the outset was data is complicated, and don't trust data that looks too clean in terms of your prior narratives. And that's been the thing is like, what we've observed so far in terms of just some of the early writing, and, obviously the book's only been out like 2 or 3 weeks, has been one, a lot of people haven't read the book and they're writing about it. And it's obvious to the authors that they haven't. But, everyone's kind of bringing their prior narratives into as lenses in terms of how they're coming, in approaching the topic. And the reality is whether you're on the political left or the political right, there's some data in here that's going to be affirmative of your particular story. On the left, are there people who have left catastrophically because of, things like abuse, sexual abuse, clergy misconduct, racism, misogyny? Yes, all of those things are there. If you're on the right, have there been people who have, left the church because their wants and desires of worshiping, a form of secular progressivism, that's there in the mix too. But it's like the challenge is looking at these things proportionally and looking at to what extent are these things, occurring. And that's where one of the things that some people appreciate about Tim Keller was his ability to diagonalize. And diagonalization is a little bit different than, the third way thing that people often, call what he was doing. But it's like our book doesn't always the Bible doesn't always look super clean in terms of the particular political narrative of one polarity or the other in the American system, especially as those polarities have evolved and changed over times and new things grafted in and old things, changed. And so the challenge is just kind of looking at all of the data and seeing what is going on and then asking ourselves what to do about that. A good friend of mine, Trevin Wax, he works for the North American Mission Board in Nashville.
Good friend of mine as well, and I've had him on Upstream several times.
Yeah, Trevin has an excellent little book entitled something to the effect of multi-directional leadership. And one of the important challenges of our time, if you're a ministry leader, pastor, clergy, or just even lay leader, is we have to be able to look in many different directions at the same time. And we have to respond to things proportional to which they're problematic. And the challenge is sometimes in the digital realm, there's a single conversation on the internet, but it's like if I'm in Central Florida versus Manhattan versus Seattle versus flyover Rust Belt, the contextual differences are going to vary pretty widely. And so the proportionality of the particular error is going to look different in each one of those contexts. And so, an error that might be the primary error in my context might be a secondary or tertiary one in yours. And so it requires a lot of wisdom to know what are the challenges that are going on the macro level versus discerning what's going on in our particular context. So the internet functions like a funhouse mirror. I went to one of these county carnival here recently, and my kids are 4 and 6, and they're running around, and it's like you stand in front of this thing, and a certain parts of your body that should appear big look small, and other parts that look small should look big. And that's the challenge in our digital age is the lenses sometimes that we're having in national conversations don't help us as much in our contextual conversations. And things that might be more proportional on the national conversation might be disproportional in our various local contexts. I don't think that accounts for all of the various disputes, that happen, on the internet, but it certainly accounts for some of those things to an extent. And so hopefully with this research, we can help people have a better sense of how proportional the issues are, and are there problems on the left flank and the right flank? Yes. The secular progressives largely already left. Now the dechurching that's happening among evangelicals is largely on the secular right. And so, the kind of rise of the populist right that seems to be increasingly less religious seems to be, kind of siphoning many people out of the church and into a place where at least the horse is politics and the cart is the faith or the gospel. And sometimes these things are really mashed up where you don't really know where politics starts and stops and where the faith really begins. So that's certainly occurring, but it would be a misnomer, to just only focus on that and not say that there aren't problems in the other direction as well. And people who are just leaving church because they want their sexual freedom and they want their political freedom. And they're willing to give up the treasure in the field of Jesus Christ for other wants and desires in their soul. And this too is a distortion.
I'm talking today with Michael Graham, co-author of The Great Dechurching. Who's leaving? Why are they going? And what will it take to bring them back? We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. Do worldview conversations intimidate you? Do you feel like you have to have all the answers to navigate secular culture effectively? In his new book, Street Smarts, Using Questions to Answer Christianity's Toughest Challenges, apologist Greg Koukl shows you how to navigate the most common and challenging topics brought up in cultural conversations today. Things like the compatibility of God and science, the trustworthiness of Scripture, gender and sexuality, and more. Through sound reasoning and practical examples, you'll learn how to graciously turn the tables, help unbelievers examine the gaps in their worldview, and point them to Christ as the best explanation of all reality. As a thank you for your gift to the Colson Center this month, we'll send you a copy of Street Smarts so you can learn to navigate these important conversations with confident and informed faith. Request your copy today at colsoncenter.org/upstreetsmarts. We're back on Upstream talking with Michael Graham, co-author of The Great Dechurching. Michael, I think one of the tendencies that seizes us in a moment like this, where we look at the graphs, we see the dechurching happening before our eyes, we see pews emptying, is this circular firing squad impulse. You're talking a moment ago about how there are different stories we tell ourselves about what the problem is, who's to blame, and of course what the solution will be because of that. And it turns into this moment of recrimination where everyone is saying, well, it's your distinctive that's causing this problem. It's you who are driving people away from the church. It's your style. It's your evangelistic emphasis. It's your way of engaging politics, whatever. And everyone's got their story. And so a book like this is very helpful for sorting through those. And I know you're resistant to this because you are a student of the data, and data is complicated, right? But I wonder if you were pressed and you had to sort of say, what is the overall trend happening here? When we look at that graph and the exponential decline of church attendance that's even now ravaging evangelical congregations, what's happening here on a macro level? Is there one thing that we can point to and say that is the biggest single factor that's involved?
So let me point to here's three categories. One category is stuff that's going on inside the church. Another category is history. And a third category is basically cultural shifts, which would also relate to there's some overlap between cultural shifts and history. Let me go kind of one by one of each of those three things, because they're all in complex ways at the same time, all influencing, I think, what we're seeing in the data. But let me start with the history piece. When America was at its height of being churched, roughly 70% of Americans went to church on a regular basis in the 1970s. And things begin to trail off a little bit from there, but not by much. A couple, percent here, percent there, year over year. But then things really started to pick up, kind of their decline in the late 80s, and really kind of picked up in the early mid 90s. And so what happened there, one key event historically, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Up until that point, to be American was to be Christian in some ways. Growing up for me, I'm 41. When somebody said, "Yeah, I'm not a Christian," it wasn't uncommon to, for somebody to ask you, "Are you a communist?" Because
are you now, or have you ever been a communist?
Yeah, the great enemy of the United States was, the godless atheists of the Soviet Union, and there's a reason why politically, we had "In God We Trust," added to our money, and added under God to our Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s. All of these things were a response, to the rise of communism. And so with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, then to be American, well, oftentimes you identify yourself sometimes, we are not these other people, and so that became less clear on, what are Americans not. And then a decade later, you have the people that, ran the two airplanes into, the Twin Towers and into the Pentagon. And now the enemy is religious fundamentalists. And, during the same time, you have the rise of first the internet and then high speed internet, and then here's some things that have happened in the last 30 years. Students now have advantages over teachers because of access to the internet. You had the rise of the new atheism in the early part of this millennium. You had Y2K, Bowling Alone, the Spotlight report on the Boston diocese, and then the revelations in the decades to come that this isn't just a Roman Catholic issue. We had the Great Recession, smartphones, ubiquitous porn, the end of the Cold War, Gene Robinson, our decadent era that Ross Douthat talks about. Just think about the music of the early 90s. You had, I think, perhaps the single most prophetic song lyric in Smell Like Teen Spirit. Here we are, now entertain us. You have the whole movement of people who are good without God. You have the rise of expressive individualism. The like button is created in 2009. Obergefell, Columbine, mass shootings. George Floyd. We can go. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor. You could go ad infinitum on all of these different things. These are massive shifts that just change how, for different people, there's different inflection points for the things that just kind of resonate for them, or a switch gets flipped. But from a historical standpoint, though, I do think that the collapse of the Soviet Union and 9/11, and then combined with the internet. So think about this. When I was growing up in the early mid-90s, how people were largely formed and shaped were through mediating institutions, education, local church, all real life, your neighbors. I play basketball 3 hours a day, after school every day, at the pickup games at the basketball court. It's like I grew up outside and offline. But how are people being formed and shaped today? Largely, it's more through their information diet than anything else. And that's an unconscious, subconscious process. And so little of that is in real life. Trust in institutions are eroding. And people are growing audiences by liquidating trust in those institutions. And of course, they're doing it all through the internet. And so the internet has really complicated the ways in which people are formed and shaped as humans. And then related to all of this is just the inertia of American life. The inertia of American life is towards consumerism and towards individualism. And so when I look at the data, I see a lot of consumerism and I see a lot of individualism. And I see people who are anxious, depressed, lonely, and many who have suicidal thoughts or ideation.
Oh, we write about the mental health epidemic all the time at Breakpoint. This is, it really is historic in its proportions, and it's clear that there's a great void that's consuming people at this point. What you're saying, though, it raises the question for me of to what extent the Great Dechurching actually corresponds to, you mentioned Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, a second ago. To what extent it just corresponds to the disillusion of institutions as a whole, of our life together as a whole. Because, when people say churches are emptying, churches are doing badly as an institution, my first question is always, well, compared to what? What institution is thriving right now other than the government and the internet?
So Gallup had a really interesting update. They've been tracking 14 different institutions for a long time on the relative trust of adult Americans with respect to these 14 institutions. And across every birth cohort, on 13 of those 14 institutions, only one institution in America has the public trust grown in it, and that is the military, United States military. Every other institution has had its trust in it eroded, some very significantly. Now, the interesting thing was religious institutions have only declined the fifth least. In other words, relative to other institutions, it's not as bad as what it could be. And so, yeah, I mean, and this is the question, right? Is how much of this dechurching just has to do with cultural headwinds, and how much of it has to do with ways in which we can grow as individuals and as local churches. And I think it's both of those things at the same time. We're naive to think that it's all one or all the other. And I think it's going to be both of those things at the same time. Now, we don't have much control over what's going on in large technology and in the mediums and pathways with which people are formed. On an individual, or even communal basis, we can encourage people to have a better information diet. But by and large, we can't do much about the inertia of consumerism, individualism, the therapeutic, these kinds of things. That's outside of our purview. But what it's inside of
at least not in the short term. These are macro trends that go over generations. They're not going to change in a couple of years.
Now, I mean, that doesn't mean we just throw up our hands, and just, acquiesce and whatnot to those things. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our frame should also be one of, kind of all out culture war as well. There's a big highway in between those into those, the ditch and the median. But, there's a lot of wisdom needed, to that. But the flip side of that, though, is, I think there's still a lot there that we can do interpersonally. And there's a lot that we can do with the kinds of churches that we are building and that we're making. And, repentance, reform, and renewal. This is the cycle of the Christian life. We're always sinning. And so the mark of a mature Christian isn't necessarily that they're sinning progressively less, even though that might happen. We might have, victory over a particular area in a long obedience in the same direction. But I think even more important than that is the quickness with which we repent. That's the mark of maturity, I think, when we look at the text. And so, how is there urgency for us in terms of the people that God's putting in front of us consistently? Are we willing to disrupt and have some inconvenience in our life in order to care for those people? And are we willing to intentionally graft in new habits and new rhythms of hospitality? And are we willing as local churches to hold up mirrors to ourselves, and to see, Lord, how can we grow? How can we be, a more beautiful bride for you and for our community?
So let's do a mirror and then a wide angle lens, because it sounds like to me you're saying the two typical attitudes people will approach a book like this with will be let's call it the right wing or conservative attitude, which is that, well, the problem is people have just become worse in our culture. Our culture has gone to the dogs, and church is no longer relevant to people who are worshiping themselves, right? So it's the culture's fault. So let's address that one. And then I also want to hear you address the left-wing impulse. We'll call it the left-wing or liberal or progressive impulse, which would be to come to the church and say, you're declining, you're dying. What did you guys do wrong? How did you screw this up? Because that's the impulse that I think, if you go back a few years to a writer like Rachel Held Evans, where she wrote I think it was CNN, she wrote this checklist of things that a church needs to do, the church in America needs to do if they want to recover from the loss of membership. And it was basically like sign on to every plank of the Democratic Party platform, right? Because that's working super well for the Protestant mainline churches. Those are two opposite perspectives on what's happening. Like, it's the church's fault or it's the culture's fault. What's true about each of those? And then kind of try to harmonize them for us, if you would.
Yeah. So first, for the folks who are on more the right, who have their concerns about, the broader culture, where they're right is in the analysis of what took place among mainline Protestantism. And if we lose doctrine and just gospel clarity in our frame with respect to culture and society, then we just become outposts for do-gooding, one, we lose the reason why. Why do we exist? And people can also find those things without Christ. You can have Christless do-gooding.
Yeah, just turn on Oprah.
Yeah, there's therapeutic versions of that. There's justice, versions of that, and so on and so forth. Now, where the folks on the right would be wrong would be in the boogeyman of secular university. What's interesting is that, at least for dechurched evangelicals, the more education that you got, the less likely you were to dechurch. So much so that, remember, 1 in 6, adult Americans have dechurched. Among evangelicals, only 3% of evangelicals who got a graduate degree dechurched. That's like 1/8 the rate of the broader culture. And so now, are people dechurching a lot in that 18 to 29 or 13 to 30-year-old age range? Yes. But it doesn't appear to be really the cause being the secular university. So I think that's a myth. I would also say to that group on the right that there probably ought to be a little bit greater concern for political syncretism, particularly among the rise of the kind of populist right. And I think that's a concern that is disproportionate to what is being evidenced. I think racism and misogyny should also deserve a little bit more attention for those who are more wired that direction. We ought to be living with other people in an understanding way and have a degree of empathy on how their experiences might be different than ours, particularly when there's either cultural or class distance. Now, moving to, just kind of harmonizing on the left, I think that there is a disproportionate emphasis on the left of people who are dechurching catastrophically. In our book, we call them dechurch casualties. The tendency there is to make it such that everybody is leaving because of these things, and everybody is leaving because churches have become so toxic and so unhealthy and so full of wicked, hypocritical people that everybody's leaving because the church is scoring own goals on itself constantly. Now, is that there? Do those things exist? Are there people who, have suffered underneath really horrific things and had really bad things, done to them, whether that's, clergy, Orlando is like, we're a mecca for pastors behaving badly. I could give you a nasty laundry list of things, and some of which people know about, and other things. There's secrets here, that only the pastors know in this city. But
Florida's a wild place, y'all.
It is. So many Florida, man. But proportionally speaking, I would critique those on the left flank to say that your concerns about these things are more disproportionate than what the data would support. Now, I'm not saying that those problems don't exist. I'm not saying that those aren't serious ethical issues. They are. And those things should be dealt with in a serious way. As any ethical issue, and anytime we're out of step with God's word, with respect to ethics, that's a serious situation. What I would say there is that the flagellation that is occurring there is disproportionate to what we're experiencing. And I would say that the left is overemphasizing the role of what was happening internally in terms of inside churches, and it is not paying attention enough to what is going on the larger cultural shifts. And the opposite is true of those on the right. The right is not paying attention enough to what's going on inside, the challenges that are internal, and their focus is largely external. So in the simplest ways, those to my right, I want to say, hey, can we take a little bit closer audit of ourselves and hold up a mirror to ourselves? And then for those who are, on the left, I kind of want to turn them around instead of looking at the mirror. Hey, can we look out this window outside here?
That's better than my wide angle lens metaphor. I like the window better.
Yeah, so I just want to, turn them around. Let's look at some of the things that are just going on, and just in terms of technology, history, some of these different kinds of things that are just far more macro and far more difficult to, stop, change, on an individual by individual basis.
Okay, so I don't think we have to make the case on a podcast like this that people coming back to church would be a good thing. I have some ideas, and I'm sure you do, about the type of church we'd like people to come back to. But one of the surprising things about your book is how surprisingly hopeful it is, that we have good reasons to be hopeful, that the doom and gloom and disaster scenarios, or explanations at any rate, for the dechurching, they don't really pan out. The reasons are much more boring than what a lot of people would try to assume as we sensationalize. So if the news is better than you expected, what is the response from the church? Because you're saying we can change some things. There are things that we can do better, bad habits that we can get over, ways that we can engage those who have left that will bring many of them back. What are those ways? Sketch broadly for us what it looks like to wisely respond to the Great Dechurching.
I want to talk about this in terms of things that can be done in two categories. One, on the individual basis, and then second, on the institutional basis. And both of these things are going to have to be a kind of double helix that occur at the same time in order for much progress to be made. So on the individual basis, the simplest thing that I would say that all of us need to be growing in is just relational wisdom. In the book, we talk about 6 key awarenesses of what it looks like to, possess relational wisdom, and that's God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how other people are experiencing you, cultural awareness, and emotional awareness. We talk about, we define each of those things, but that's something that's really key. So for so many people, how they are experiencing us is so important to them. And we could be bringing all of the best ideas to them, but if either our ethics or hypocrisy undermines that, or if we're engaging them with an affect that doesn't mirror what's great about the gospel itself, then that creates dissonance for people, and that dissonance creates distrust. So on the individual basis, I would say, the need of the hour is for relational wisdom. And again, these are things we're talking about things that are within our control. Then on the institutional basis, there's a lot of things that can be done. And so we built an entire website, dechurching.com. I haven't even talked about it anywhere, really. I think this is maybe the first time I've ever mentioned it. But we built a whole resource for local churches. It's basically an audit, a 20-point audit of, hey, these are 20 things that occur in a local church that can impact dechurching. And it's meant for those who are kind of key stakeholders, leadership team, elder board, those different kinds of things to go through. Okay, here's a 20-point checklist of how we're doing in, this particular area. So here's an example. The number one reason why people dechurched is they moved. That's a horribly, banal, kind of reason, but it's the top reason. And then the next one after that is attendance was inconvenient. And then actually that was third. And then the second was a marriage divorce or remarriage, divorce, or some other significant family change. So
the top 3 reasons people dechurch have nothing to do with something the church messed up on. That's amazing.
Now, the reasons that are after that, they're not too far behind it in terms of, proportionality. So what we did in that resource, the Rechurching toolkit that's on, that we have on dechurching.com is, so here's one example. Does your church have a process for how to help somebody that just told you that they're going to move from your community to a new community? Every single person, whether you're on staff with a church or you're just, somebody who goes to church and loves Jesus, when somebody moves, it's an emergency. That's the most high-risk situation for dechurching there is. And so one thing that in other words, they leave your church and then they don't pick up on the other end of the move with a new church. Correct. It's the biggest risk scenario for somebody, dechurching, is they just move to a different community. Because you end up, all it takes is 30 days of doing something or not doing something to develop a new habit. And so, and you got a lot of stuff, I moved twice in the last year, and it's a lot, Now, thankfully, it was all in the same community, but it's like, we give people rails to run on there in that resource of, okay, if you don't have a system or a process as a local church on how to help people who are moving, do due diligence on the new community, help them find, 2 to 5, ideally, good local churches, and then follow up with them, at month 3, at month 6, and see how that process is going. Are they, on a progressive path towards at least consistent attendance, if not hopefully membership. That's just one example. And there's 19 more in those resources that are all objectively tied to, these are things that you can do as a local church that are both offensive and defensive, helping to close the back door, defense, open the front door, and send people out more equipped, offense. So we created that resource specifically for local churches on dechurching.com. So, moving would just be one of those things. Now, if you're just a person and you have you're just an individual and you have a friend in your church that's, moving from your community to, some other community that is too far from where from where they're at right now, help that person, love them, go and, maybe that, help them find those, 2 to 5 places to check out, spend some time, listen to some sermons, write up some notes of, hey, here's what I observed, on, the digital footprint of this particular, of this church and that one. Help them in that due diligence process of, finding a good place to land. And so those are things that all of us can do that are very actionable and very, honestly, it's the bar is not super high. So
the only important thing or the only worthwhile thing I think I've ever done in my life that was purely de novo, my own initiative and desire. In other words, I wasn't told by a friend about it or invited or brought into a group that's already doing that, is scuba diving. So that's how, that's relatively inconsequential, right? Everything else, whether it's my marriage, meeting my spouse, my job, my education, the books that I've read, the churches that I've been to, the musicians that I've listened to, everything is the result of exactly the kind of relationship that you're describing. And often it's a very low investment. It's just simply somebody that I trust saying, hey, Shane, I heard that you like listening to Andrew Peterson's music. Well, he's written this new fantasy series, the Wingfeather Saga. You and your kids would probably love this. Next thing we know, this is like a central pillar of our time together and our, the love I share with my kids. And it's like, just because somebody at my church took that moment to tell me about it. Well, church works the same way. Every church I've been to has been somebody on some level going, hey, you want to come to this one because it sounds like your theology is developing in that direction, or there's a great community here, or they meet in a really cool building and have cool music or something. And it's just that kind of thing. I love that you're saying that because I don't think we understand the degree or appreciate the degree to which simple inertia moves us toward consequential decisions in this life.
I love it. And it's true.
Well, I think we're out of time here. This is a topic that's so vast and so important to address because we're looking at these trends, we're writing about these trends, we're speculating about them, we're fighting about them, and there's a lot of that recrimination that I talked about happening, where we're just in this circular firing squad trying to figure out who to blame. But the whole tone of this book is very calm, very easygoing, and very curious. The tone you strike, I think you guys did a great job of putting across this message without the recriminating attitude, without the anger or desperation, and just the sense that, hey, this is a challenge. The church has been through challenges before. Spoiler alert. It's been around for a while. This isn't the first time, and God's got it under control. And hey, there's a lot of stuff that we can probably do right now that's going to have an eternal impact for those around us in the midst of this crazy shift that we're witnessing. So thank you so much, Michael, for co-writing this book. Grateful for your colleagues as well and your co-authors. Thank you for joining me today to just help clear away some of the fog on this extremely foggy issue.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Be sure to rate the podcast and subscribe in your listening app. You can also connect with us on social media by visiting upstream.colsoncenter.org.